Let's bring in for analysis Rihannon Smith, Managing Director of the group Libya-Analysis. Rihannon, thank you very much for joining us here on France 24. We appreciate your time. Can I start with a very general question to you? And it's probably a bit of a crystal ball question too, so I apologise for that. Where do you think this crisis is going?
As you said, that is the big question at the moment. It's really very difficult to know. Things on the ground are changing very quickly. The situation is very volatile. The kind of actions of the forces involved is difficult to predict. At the moment, a kind of political solution, a negotiated solution to this, unfortunately, doesn't look too likely. What we're probably most likely to see is a kind of continuation of these clashes in limited areas of Tripoli. So at the moment, they're focusing in the southern area around the old Tripoli International Airport. It's likely those clashes will continue. It's difficult to see Haftar's forces retreating at this point. It's equally difficult to see the Tripoli and Mazrasa militias in and around the capital allowing them to enter. So, I mean, it could go in any number of ways, but at the moment, in the next few days, I think that's the most likely state of play.
Rihanna, the UN has called for a ceasefire. That was ignored on Sunday. It's called again. That's likely to be ignored too, isn't it? I mean, basically, what can anyone do from the outside?
Yeah, I mean, and as you said, when Haftar initially moved on the capital and announced his operation, it's while the UN Secretary General was actually in Tripoli at the time, which I think says everything about the kind of, the trust or respect placed in the value of the UN in that sense. I think there are still things that the international community can do. And it is important to remember that part of the reason why we're in this situation, part of the reason why Haftar felt that he was able to launch this very sort of brazen move on the capital, is that really he's been doing something similar in southern Libya for the last few weeks. That hasn't really been criticised. There's been a ramp up in rhetoric and kind of a narrative of military domination in and around Tripoli over the last 2 weeks. Nothing had really been said on that. Haftar is receiving sort of direct support from a lot of international countries, from the UAE, from France, from Saudi Arabia, and there has been a failure in most parts to directly criticise Haftar and his moves. So I think in terms of a way forward, what the UN and the international community can do is really to show a united front against this and to really put some meaning behind their words. We hear lots of these statements, which we've seen over the last few days of, reiterating the need for humanitarian truce, the de-escalation of conflict, the fact there is only a political solution. But unfortunately, often their actions and their follow-through on those kind of statements are minimal, and therefore actors on the ground really have no incentive at the moment to stop the kind of behaviour that they're engaging in.
Rihanna, if one analyses what's happened since Gaddafi was overthrown, Muammar Gaddafi, the former dictator back in 2011, was overthrown and murdered, it might look to the less astute observer that the world basically doesn't care what's happening in Libya, the way it's descended into this kind of chaos. And we witness that still today. In terms of how that can be put right, is it for the West to sort of get involved and do that? Or is the West basically scared of getting involved in some kind of, well, for want of a better word, quagmire situation where they get bogged down in what a horrible sort of civil conflict?
Well, I think there's a number of things at play here. The one is that actually Libya does matter to a lot, particularly of European countries. Italy, for example, it's a huge issue for Italy. It's heavily involved in the country in terms of energy supply, the migrant crisis, likewise with France and others for similar reasons. People, and Europe in particular, cares about Europe because of it, cares about Libya, apologies, because of its strategic location, because of its access to the rest of North Africa, the oil supplies, and the flow of people that are coming through the country. Unfortunately, what that means, though, is that policy, international policy on Libya is dictated by those external priorities, which differ between a range of countries. The Gulf countries are also heavily involved, and Russia, as you mentioned in your report. So that is really the difficulty, that actually a lot of this policy is not really focusing on what is helpful to the Libyan conflict. Now, yes, this is a Libyan conflict, it's a Libyan political solution, and it needs to be Libyans who ultimately find and dictate and agree on that solution. But the international community, the UN and others, do have an important role in facilitating that. And I think the difficulty at the moment is often the international approach to this ends up just creating more division, ends up driving more partisan behaviour on the ground, because different Libyan parties can go to different international backers with kind of different approaches and often get traction that way. So although it is obviously a Libyan sort of problem to solve. There are elements of the international behaviour and policy that are also contributing to the situation, and which can be changed if there is the international will there.
And we wait to see what happens there, clearly, with the conflict for Tripoli growing, with Haftar's forces closing in, and clearly people are starting to flee already. It's going to exacerbate many of the problems that are already besetting and befalling Libya. We started with a crystal ball question, Rihannon. If you'll indulge me, it's another crystal ball question. The problems you've spoken about, say, migration and the issue with oil supply, energy, if you turn all that in its head, turn it around the other way, of course, there's massive potential there. Can you tell us a bit about the potential Libya has, how Libya could, if things went well and things were well handled over the next 10, 20 years, develop into a very different place?
Yeah, definitely. And this is the thing. I mean, I know you mentioned earlier about the sort of word quagmire with relation to Libya, and it's certainly a complex country. There's no doubt about that. There are many issues that need to be solved, but I don't think any of those issues are intractable. Libyans don't want war. They certainly don't want this conflict now that's erupting in Tripoli. They want to find a way forward and a solution to a lot of their problems. It's a large country with a small population. It has the oil reserves, hundreds of thousands of miles of Mediterranean coast. It's in a great kind of geographic location. And actually, a lot of the things that divide Libyans at present, or that lead to a lot of this conflict, are not intractable. There aren't the same kind of deep-rooted divisions you have in some of the other countries in other parts of the Arab world, and there's a huge amount of potential there. And I think, prior to this latest move on Tripoli, that there was some real hope that through the political process there may be some beginnings of a kind of bottom-up reconciliation that could lead to some of these problems being solved. And the danger is that if this kind of conflict continues, not only does it ruin people's lives, damage and undermine the political landscape, also the trust between and among Libyans, but also between the international community and the outside world. But problems like the economy, which in Libya, you always think of Libya as being a relatively wealthy country, and it has resources, but they are very poorly mismanaged, and the sort of centralization of the economy and how that is managed is in a dire state. And things like that, the infrastructure, the oil production, all of those things, electricity, water, there are crises that if this situation continues, if conflict escalates, then really Libya could be a whole lot worse, just in terms of daily living standards as well as the political situation. But as you've mentioned, it shouldn't take too much if they can overcome some of these problems to really move forwards and have a much brighter future.
So the future could be bright for Libya, as you're saying, Rihannon, and we wait to see what happens with the current crisis, which looks like it could sadly plunge the country towards a civil conflict, which of course would have, as you just outlined, terrible consequences. Rihannon Smith, Manager of Libya-Analysis, thank you very much for joining us here on France 9 Cat. We appreciate your time.